everyone. Hi, Thesis.
Lights going out.
I'm Renee Maloney, and welcome to my senior thesis documentary. I got into theater because when I was 5 years old, my sister was in a production of Annie. I wanted to be my sister so bad in that moment that I decided the second I was able to, I was going to join our theater. My theater journey does not start with acting. I was incredibly stage fright when I was young, and so I didn't want to act. Instead of auditioning for a role, I asked our theater director if I could do anything else that didn't require me to be on stage. She said yes, of course, and she put me on the crew. I was on the crew throughout elementary and middle school, and when I got to high school, I started acting. I really loved acting, but towards the end of my senior year, I decided that I wanted to do stage management. While I had been acting for 4 years, I had a lot of stage fright my senior year. So when I was applying to different theater programs, it was important to me that I didn't have to do an audition. I was okay with an interview, but something about getting on stage and singing in front of a bunch of people I didn't know really made me nervous. And so I looked for theater programs that allowed me to interview rather than audition. Xavier was one of those schools. I came to Xavier on February 29th for my interview, and luckily that same evening I was accepted into the program. Something that drew me to the Xavier Theater Department was that I would be able to stage manage, or at least assistant stage manage, the first semester that I was here. I was super excited about this prospect, as all the other colleges that I had auditioned for said that there would be no option but to wait until the end of your freshman year or even the beginning of your sophomore year to be part of the theater. And I wanted to dive headfirst into stage management. Freshman year, the first show that I stage managed was Behind the Screens. As we were in the middle of COVID, we were unable to do stage productions, so we came up with a virtual new film festival as a way to keep making art. I was a part of Comeback Productions' performance of Behind the Screens. The show came with a lot of challenges. Our initial design was to do everything in person and to be able to have our actors film with each other. But in the middle of our filming, one of our actors was diagnosed with COVID, and they decided to spend the rest of their semester at home with their family isolating in order to keep from having any further incidents. That meant that we had to change our plan very last minute. We changed from a more in-person production feel to a bit more of a collective or collage approach. We would film with our 3 actors that were in Cincinnati, and we would have our actor who was isolating in Chicago send us videos that we could patch together. But we still wanted that feeling that everyone was together, so we chose to utilize Zoom in order to have shots where all of our actors were together. We wanted to highlight that even in the isolation we were all feeling with COVID, there were still points in time where we could come together and feel as though we were connected to each other. I also had many successes with this show. This was the first show that I had stage managed, and so I was really excited to get to learn a lot of new things. I got to work with a bunch of new paperwork, like a daily call and rehearsal report. I also learned how to thoroughly and clearly communicate with my production team. My biggest takeaway from this show is that flexibility is key. Changes are going to happen, and you need to be able to roll with the punches as they come. Next show I did was Something Borrowed, Someone Blue. Something Borrowed, Someone Blue is a choose-your-own-adventure Zoom show. Cast of over 20 people, 9 of which wrote the show. The show would start out in one big Zoom room and split into 4 different breakout rooms. Each breakout room had a different cast following a different storyline that ran throughout the show. The audience would then be put into the breakout room so that they could witness parts of the show. The audience was allowed to hop between breakout rooms in order to see different parts of the show. While this was a lot to oversee, this did bring in one of my major successes of the show, which was communication. I was communicating with the entire cast through GroupMe. I had table heads, which were the lead actors in each table, in one GroupMe. I would give them a go over GroupMe, and they would give their cast individual goes, so they would know when to start the scene. I was also communicating with my ASM, Anna colleague, who acted as a board op for this show. I had to give her cues, which was something I had never done before, and I had to make sure that all of my cues for Anna and my actors lined up. This meant that I had to make sure that I was communicating with Anna and my actors all at once so that the cues would line up. My biggest takeaway from this show is fake it till you make it. I've never staged a show like this, and Zoom theater was still very new, so there was no real guidelines for how I was meant to do anything. That meant that I made a lot of stuff on the fly while also trying to follow the same routine that you would for a normal on-stage production. Sophomore year. American Idiot was the first on-stage production that I was involved in at Xavier. Myself and Abby Shear were ASMs under Lauren Davidson. This was new to me. I had never ASM'd before, so I had no idea what I was going to be doing during rehearsals or performances, as the entire concept was really new to me. Even though the plan was to return to the next semester completely unmasked, during the early days of rehearsal, COVID started spiking again, and we found out that we would have to be masked for the rest of the semester. I got to learn a lot during this show. I got to work with a bunch of new paperwork I had never seen before. I had to work with the shift plot, which tracks where props and set pieces go throughout a performance. That meant that I had to be aware of everything that was happening on stage during rehearsals. Another fun thing I got to learn was how to cue a fly rail. I was going to have to communicate with Sarah Maloney, who was at the other end of the fly rail. That meant that there was no way I was going to be able to tell her when to go, so I instead had to give her a visual cue. While I had to communicate with Sarah, who was on the other end of the fly rail, I also had to make sure that the actors weren't getting in the way of Sarah seeing me. Another thing that I had to work with during the show was masks. There's a lot of different things happening in each aspect of the show, and so every now and again an actor would forget to put a mask on. This meant that I had to remind some actors that they needed to put a mask on for safety. My biggest takeaway from American Idiot is if you think you can't do something, you won't. During American Idiot, I dealt with a lot of self-doubt. I had never ASM'd before, and I saw all the amazing work that Abby and Lauren were doing, and I was worried that I wasn't living up to the same standards that they were. But I knew that if I didn't try, that I would never succeed in what I was doing. So even when I thought something was too hard or that I wasn't able to do something because I didn't have the foreknowledge of how to do it, I still had to try my hardest. The next show I did was Mamma Mia. I came into Mamma Mia 4 days after American Idiot closed. That was a quick turnaround time, but it was still 2 weeks after Mamma Mia had already started their rehearsals. I was also coming into a new team, so with that came a lot of nerves. I was worried that they would have set ways of doing things that I wouldn't understand, and that I would be behind on some aspect of the show. But I now had a newfound confidence in being an ASM, so I was ready for whatever was thrown my way. I had to work on new pieces of paperwork like a vocal tracker and a French scene breakdown, which tracked less set and props and more people and movement. This is where my love of paperwork came out of. I like to know where things are and how things work backstage, so a lot of that came through in my paperwork. I started to find my love of paperwork. I love knowing exactly where everything is. I wanted to make sure that I was tracking everything for Josie, so I became very detailed in my tracking of individuals' movement. I also wanted to make sure that my vocal tracking was right, so sometimes during our rehearsals, I would walk backstage just to make sure that everyone who I thought was going to be singing in a scene was. My biggest takeaway from Mamma Mia is to take opportunities as they come to you. I asked to join Mamma Mia. I knew it would be rough coming off of the show and straight onto another show, but I wanted to be able to work on as many processes as I could in order to better learn how to be an ASM and a stage manager in preparation for the next semester. The next show that I got to work on was Proof. Proof was part of the Rep series, which was 3 shows that ran at the same time. Even though cases of COVID had started to die down during the spring semester, our cast was hit by COVID. Overall, we had 24 rehearsals, 12 of which had to be held on Zoom. That meant that in the 12 days that we were in person, we had to get a lot of stuff done. We had 12 days to block the entire show, so all the character building and line learning needed to happen during our Zoom rehearsals. Another major challenge that we faced happened during Tech Week. The Wednesday before Tech Week, we ended up having a major snowstorm that closed the university down for almost 3 days. Because we were part of the Rep series, all 3 shows would be teching at the same time. In the original tech schedule, Proof was going to be teching 11 to 3 on the Saturday and Sunday of tech. This changed on Friday once we found out that we were clear to be at the university for the weekend. While Proof didn't need much tech to begin with, I was still really nervous to only have 1 day to tech a show, as I had never called a show before, and I was worried that I wouldn't get enough practice in beforehand. We ended up having the entire show teched on the first day. While Proof brought a lot of challenges, it also brought a lot of successes. This was the first show that I ever got to call. I got to call the show from the catwalks, which presented its own set of challenges, namely the fact that I'm not a quiet person by nature, and the audience was sitting directly under me, so I had to be very conscious of my volume. But calling the show was a really exciting part of stage management that I hadn't really been able to see in the same light. My biggest takeaway from Proof is that it's okay to not know things. I was worried that I would be expected to know how everything works, and that I wouldn't be able to have any grace throughout the process. Luckily, everyone that I worked with during the show was amazing, and they were all very patient as I learned how to do things for the first time. The next show that I worked on was Once. During Once, there was a lot of things that needed to be tracked. The show takes place on a very small stage, but there's a lot that happens. Despite Once being a small show, there's a lot of things for the stage management team to be doing. We had a lot of things that needed to be tracked, and as paperwork was one of my favorite things, I took on the job of tracking everything. During rehearsals, I would have 4 different Excel sheets pulled up at the same time. I had a French scene breakdown, a vocal tracker, an instrument breakdown, and an instrument tracker to make sure that we knew where everything and everyone was throughout the entire show. Most of the actors played 2 to 3 instruments, but some played even more than that. However, we only had a limited amount of instruments, so we had to make sure that we knew where everything was. That meant if a guitar got picked up, taken across stage, and sat down on a bar, we had to make sure that we knew it was going to be on that bar for the next actor's entrance. Even though it was stressful to do at the time, looking back at it now, the information was very helpful for our production team and helped us have a smoother flow of the show. And one of the biggest challenges we had during months was the flooring. We had taped out the set in the studio and had been working in the studio for most of the rehearsals. Once we finally moved on stage, myself, Josie Daly, and Maddie Seaplack had to take measurements of where all the spike tape lied on the stage and translate it over into the main stage theater. I think we spiked the floor 3 or 4 times before the flooring was entirely laid. My biggest takeaway from once is the more that you put in, the more that you get out. While I found it stressful to try and track absolutely everything on stage, I knew that I had to put my full effort into it. I couldn't do half of it and call it good. I needed to make sure that the work I was putting in was reflecting the effort that all of the actors and the rest of the production team was putting in. Rabbit Hole has a lot of unique challenges, both as a production and for me personally. My first challenge in the show was I was not going to be there for the majority of the first 2 weeks of rehearsal. I was going to be in RA training and rehearsals were going to be happening at the same time. That meant that I had to leave my ASM, Reese Niederhausen, in charge of rehearsals. Some of the challenges that come with the actual production of the show is that there's a lot of props. In our specific scenic design, the entire upstage portion of our stage was a child's bedroom. In total, there were over 200 individual toys that were on stage. One of the unique aspects of Rabbit Hole is that there's a lot of intimacy, both written in the stage directions and implied. That meant that we brought in an intimacy coordinator to help coach our actors. We worked a lot with our intimacy coordinator, Angelique Archer, to make sure that all of the intimacy was readable to the audience, but also was comfortable for our actors to perform every night. One of my biggest takeaways from Rabbit Hole is that tap-ins and tap-outs are for everyone. I became incredibly emotionally burnt out. I was tired, and witnessing my friends go through this incredibly intense show every night started to take a toll on me. Even though I knew they were acting, it is still hard to watch your friends go through this every night, and I started to feel emotionally burnt out towards the end of the show. And I finally understood what Angelique meant when she said tap-outs were for everyone. The next show I worked on was Our Town. One of the biggest challenges that came with Our Town was that there were a lot of conflicts. Several of the actors had jobs that ran during our rehearsal times. That meant that we would have to rely on our understudies to come in and fill in the gaps throughout the week. Another interesting part of the show was the fact that everyone was going to be seen. The show was going to take place on the main stage theater with 2 rows of audience members running parallel to the stage. That meant that the actors had to be aware that there was going to be an audience on every side of them. Another interesting part of the set design was that we wanted the entire backstage to be seen. That meant that all the crew members, including the ASMs, myself, and our lightboard op, would be seen by the audience. Myself and our lightboard op, Matthew Callis, were going to be put on a platform and tucked into a corner so that we could see the entire stage as actions were happening. We created the effect of snow falling using snow bags. A snow bag is a piece of canvas that is stringed from 2 different pipes with holes cut into it so that when you pull the pipes up and down with the fly rail, the snow falls out of it as though it's falling from the sky. It's a very neat effect to have in a show, but it can very easily get messed up. Throughout the tech process and throughout our first 3 shows, the snow went off without a hitch. During our final show, one of the fly rail operators lost his grip on one of the ropes and ended up dumping 15 pounds of fake snow all at once. But that leads to my takeaway. The show must go on. There's so many different things that happened during the performance that I thought would mess things up, but we truly just had to keep rolling and make it through the shows. The next show that I did was 95. 95 was the first musical that I ever stage managed. I hadn't been on a musical in over a year, so I felt a little out of my element, as I didn't really know what it took to stage manage a musical, but I figured I would face it head on. One of the biggest challenges with 95 was the transitions. We didn't have any set pieces until we got to Tech Week, so even though we had been miming out what we thought the transitions were going to be, actually having the full set and all of the set pieces and different elements that were going to be involved proved to be a much bigger challenge. So even though we had been miming out transitions throughout the rehearsal process, we didn't know what transitions were going to look like until we had all the pieces in place. That meant that there were a lot of transitions that we were unprepared for, as we didn't know the amount of manpower that it would take to do one transition. Even though we had a cast of about 25 people and nearly 10 crew members, each scene change required that every person be on hand. I was unaware of how big transitions were going to be, And so while I had a shift plot planned out, my shift plot was not nearly detailed enough to account for everything that we were going to be needing to do throughout every transition. I remember Stephen coming up to me during rehearsal and asking if I needed help or if I had the transitions covered. I remember thinking there was no way that I could tech a show and safely facilitate all of the scene changes. Something was going to be forgotten, and that one way or the other, something was going to end up being a safety hazard. So I told Stephen that I needed help. My biggest success during 9 to 5 was that I got back up and I kept going. Having just come off of our talent and remembering that the show must go on, I knew that even when things felt like they were too big and that everything was going to be too difficult, I needed to keep going. My biggest takeaway from 9 to 5 is actually something that Aaron Rossini, the director of our town, told me. It's rehearsal class. You're here at a college to learn. Tech is my time to learn just as much as rehearsals are an actor's time to learn. And I had to be okay with taking that space for myself. Senior year. The first show that I worked on my senior year was The Sound of Music. The Family Weekend musical is typically the largest musical that Xavier will put on in a season. I had a cast of 30 and 4 minors that were involved on the show, totaling 34 cast members. This was by far the biggest show that I had ever worked on. In order to prepare for the challenges ahead, Stephen and I decided that I should have 4 ASMs in order to help facilitate the show. We were going to split up the child wrangling duties amongst the 4 ASMs so that way no one person would get burnt out by taking care of children every day during rehearsal. Ultimately, plans shifted. I ended up having 5 ASMs total, 3 of them taking on different roles throughout the process, 2 of them remaining as just ASMs. One of my challenges that turned into a success was the way that I was communicating. Because of the size of the cast, almost every principal actor had an understudy, but all of the understudies were in the ensemble. That meant if we were calling principal actors and the ensemble at different portions of rehearsal, I had to make sure that I was calling all of the right actors to the right scenes and at the right time. My biggest takeaway from The Sound of Music is to ask for help when you need it and to accept help when it is offered. I don't like asking for help. I often think I can do everything by myself and that I don't need help from others. But I knew that in a show like The Sound of Music, that was not going to be true. I was going to have to ask for help, and I was going to have to accept that even though I thought I could do everything, I need to be able to rely on my 5 ASMs for helping me with different things throughout the shows. The next show that I worked on, or more so the next series of show that I worked on, was the Student Showcase. I was an assistant producer along with Kristen Fries and Alan Linzer. Originally, each of us was going to take a show, and that would be the show that we would assistant produce. However, during further conversations, we came to realize that myself and Kristen Fries would both be absent for part of tech rehearsals. We didn't want to leave 2 shows without an assistant producer, so we decided that all 3 of us would work on all 3 shows together. One of my main roles throughout this time was budget tracking. I kept track of all 3 budgets and gave out regular updates so that everyone involved in the production team could know just how much of the budget was left. As we got into tech, myself, Kristen Fries, and Alan Linzer all took on different roles. The show that I assisted with the most was The Moors. During tech for The Moors, I sat next to the stage manager, Allison Dybel, in order to assist her in learning the different things that a stage manager needs to do during a tech. I helped Allison take charge of her tech rehearsals. I wanted to help Allison take the space that she needed in order to run the best show that she could. Sometimes that meant that I told her exactly what to say in order to facilitate moving on to the next spot, but other times it just meant that I told her the best way I thought that she could call a cue. Ultimately, I was incredibly proud of Allison and the work that she produced during this show. I saw that Allison had a drive to learn and to do the absolute best job she could, and I really admired that. During NPC and the choreographer showcase, I was more hands-off. Prom had begun rehearsals, and so I was unable to be in the room as much as I was for The Moors. But in the times that I was able to be in rehearsals, during the times I was able to be in rehearsals and production meetings, I wanted to facilitate doing anything that I could to help. If that meant that I had to teach a crew member how to properly sweep them off the stage, then that's what I would do. If it meant that I was going to be moving some spike tape around so that the actors knew where the center of the stage would be, then that's what I would do. But I wanted to make sure that all 3 shows were going to be running as smoothly as possible in a backstage aspect. The biggest takeaway from the Student Showcase comes from working with Allison. Allison wanted to learn how to become the best version of a stage manager that she could be. That meant that Allison was constantly asking questions. She wanted to make sure that she knew exactly what was going on and that even if she messed up along the way, she was going to continue trying. The next show that I worked on was The Prom, but you'll hear plenty more of that during my oral presentation. The final show that I worked on during my time at Xavier was John Proctor's The Villain. I was an ASM under Allie Linzer. One of my biggest challenges starring John Proctor as the villain was going back to an ASM role. I hadn't been an ASM for almost 2 years. So I was afraid that I would come into this show and I would step on Allie's toes in some way. And that was the absolute last thing I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure that I was assisting Allie, not taking over for her. I wanted to empower Allie throughout the show. And sometimes that meant that I had to remind the cast that even if I knew the answer to something, that they were meant to ask Allie those types of questions. Some of the successes that I had during the show was in my taking on of new roles. I remember back to my time during American Idiot, I didn't know the role of an ASM, and I was really kind of clueless as to what I needed to be doing during rehearsal. In remembering that, I took on a bit of a leadership role in order to guide Caleb and Norm. My takeaway is that you'll never know everything, and that there was always an opportunity to learn. At this point in time, I had stage managed 8 different shows at Xavier, and I had ASM'd 3. So many people would think that I've learned it all, but that's simply untrue. You can always be learning from your peers. As I sat next to Allie during tech rehearsals, I watched as she communicated with designers and actors. You should always be learning and always be growing, especially at a collegiate theater program, which is exactly what I came to Xavier to do. So what's next for me? Currently, I don't have any direct plans following graduation. My main plan is to go home and take a break. I have been involved with 15 different processes during my time at Xavier. For the last 3 years, I have also been a resident assistant. I've been doing a lot of things in a lot of different ways, and I've been working on helping others throughout this whole time. After college, I want to focus on helping me. I want to take a break, and if that means that I have to take a break and I have to go home, then that's what that means. I've also applied for a hall director position at Xavier. While this wouldn't be the break that I've intended for myself, I have quite a bit of experience managing people. Being a hall director utilizes my skills as both a stage manager and an RA, and brings them together in a nice, lovely package. So maybe I become a hall director after graduation, or maybe I go home. Regardless, I am incredibly proud of the work that I have done to better my skills and to make an impact on the Xavier community.
Lights in 3, 2, 1.
Well, hi everyone.
Hey.
Yeah, I know. I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. I apologize. Okay. Well, hi. Welcome to the second half of my thesis, where I will be talking about my time on the prom. So I was a stage manager on the prom, and I found out about this in December. You all will learn more about that here in a minute, but let's talk about some background info on the show. So prom is set in Indiana and is about a high school student who just wants to fit in with her peers and to and to go to prom like everyone else, but she ends up not being able to, and then becomes a symbol of love and acceptance and equality amongst the people. Even if change isn't going to be made immediately, change is still possible. So let's talk about my show assignment. Stephen and I had discussed which show I was going to be on during closing night of The Sound of Music, if I'm not mistaken. Stephen asked me which shows I wanted to work on, and we had learned about this season at our last picnic the year before, and from then on I wanted to do prom. I love musicals, so prom was my show in my little noggin. So when Stephen asked me, I said, oh, I want to do prom. And then he had asked me, well, what should the other people do? The other people being Allie and Reese, namely, but we had other shows that were going to happen. She was like, well, what should everyone else do? And I said, oh, well, I think that people would be good in certain roles and that they would enjoy shows more than others and conflicts, and I was just getting myself to prom. But this was also would have been the third musical that I was on, so it wasn't like I was going in clueless. If I had just been like, this is my first musical, I would have dialed it back a bit. So on December 19th, I received a phone call from Stephen to discuss the spring semester. We hadn't had a conversation since that competition in October, so when Stephen asked if we could discuss the semester, I was like a little nervous, but I was really just expecting a phone call to talk about the show that I was on. little did I know, I was actually going to be asked to be on 5 different shows. I was asked to be an assistant producer with Allie and Kristen, as I mentioned, for the student showcase, and I was going to be an ASM on the prom. And this was very overwhelming at the time. I was not expecting this offer. But I knew that this semester was going to be a big undertaking. But I felt like, I was ready for it at the time. One of the reasons that I came to Xavier was to do as many shows as I possibly could in the 4 years that I had. And so I felt like if I didn't take on all of these roles, then I would be disappointing little me. And I would also be like doing a disservice to myself now, because I deserve to work on a bunch of shows while I have the opportunity. And I think that it would be a really interesting experience, and it was. Thanks. The rehearsal process. So those are my 2 ASMs, and then this is a picture from rehearsal as we were choreographing Love Thy Neighbor. One thing about me is I like to meet with all of my directors beforehand so that we can learn how they work in rehearsal, how they want me to run certain aspects of rehearsal, just so when we get into actual rehearsals, I'm not asking so many questions, and we can already have that sort of relationship like we're working together and not like we're meeting for the first time. So I met with Darnell and Aaron, our director and our musical director respectively, and during our conversation for plans of rehearsal, or for the grander plans of rehearsal, we talked about our specific rehearsal schedule. Darnell and Aaron both wanted to work with big ensemble numbers first, and I also love that idea. I think it's really good to get all the big numbers out of the way so that you can focus on more character building with your individual actors and scenes. However, we were still doing the student showcase at the time, and so it was, working with ensemble was a bit difficult because 12 of our actors were involved with across the different shows, so it was hard to coordinate a time where all of them could be together. This ended up causing a bit of issues trying to get into the grooves of rehearsal, because there were the 3 different shows and the 3 different tech processes that were running both on different days and sometimes 2 in the same day. It was a big to-do of who can be in rehearsal, who can't be in rehearsal. And I had received a bunch of conflicts that were more or less correct. And so I ended up having to leverage my knowledge as the assistant producer and of the showcase and the stage manager of the prom to create a specific document that tracked who was going to be in which rehearsal room and when. And I ended up having to work on this with Steven because there was a lot of actors that were involved in different things at once, and I wanted to make sure that as we were getting into rehearsals, I was calling the right people who could actually be there. Finally, we were able to move into rehearsals, and how exciting. We made our plans with a few challenges along the way, but ultimately we got there. We were able to have some flexibility with our team and with some of our actors. Some actors would leave rehearsal in here in the student showcase, and then in 15 minutes be in rehearsal in the prom, and I'm really grateful for their perseverance in doing all of that at the same time. The first several rehearsals were music rehearsals that took place in either the theater or the Alumni Center basement. I was going to put a picture of the Alumni Center basement on there with our setup, but those pictures do not look as good as I thought they did when I took them. But trust me, the basement is a big empty room, and I would put chairs out to make it a little choir number. During our first rehearsals, I was without an ASM. Both Hannah Barbie and Reese Cedarhausen were working on the Moors, so that meant that I was in rehearsal by myself. So sometimes that meant that I would get to rehearsal over an hour early to set things up, specifically for our music rehearsals where I had to set up all the chairs, the piano, the speaker. So I was just very stressed in trying to do all that myself, but luckily they did end up coming in once they got done with the Moors. I was really glad that they got to join us, so then I was able to delegate setup and tear down tasks. And each day things started moving a lot faster because I had someone to set up the speakers, someone to put the tables out, someone to set up the piano and the dance numbers to get props out. ASMs are very important. Paperwork. This is my next slide, is paperwork and prep work. So I did all of my prep work in a single week in December.
For not only this, but for also my RA job, I figured I was going to have a lot of things that I needed to get done this semester, so I did all of it in one fell swoop. Because an incredibly important aspect of the show is paperwork, and in a musical there is a lot of paperwork to be done. That's kind of that. So let's talk about these pieces of paperwork a little bit. Sorry, I'm moving. Oh, it's interactive. You all can't see it very well, it's a little far back. But so this is a sound cue preliminary list. That was so rude of my paper. Anyway, it's really excellent. Yeah, you got it. Thank you. So this is my preliminary sound cues. What I do is I go through a list that the director gave me and also the script, and I sort of go through, it says that there's a knock at the door, a bell rings, this, that, and I mark it all down so that way when we get into rehearsals and we're adding new things, it's not starting from nothing, and that way also when we get to tech, our sound designers have like preemptive knowledge of what sounds they should be cueing into the board. And then I have a preliminary costume tracker, which I had actually never made before for this show, but it ended up being really, really helpful. Because as you can see, there's like a couple of people on this, like several things all at once. And this was helpful in tracking who was in a scene and when, but also who they were being in the scene. If you can see, Sienna Blaze was at one point, she was Sally Bowles, and then had 5 pages to become a student. So it was very helpful in figuring out, can we have them in the scene? Are they able to do this sort of quick change? And then my stuff in yellow were like very quick changes because like Grace going from Mrs. Green to Mrs. Green in a different outfit is one thing, but going from a student to a grown adult is a bit harder of a change, and so all of those got highlighted in yellow. And then this is my scene breakdown. So my scene breakdown includes who is in a scene and when. It's broken down by scenes and by songs. So that way, when we were just working the musical portion of What Girl or Changing Lives Reprise, I didn't call everyone who was in the number. I called the people who were speaking and singing in the number. Because you don't want to have an actor be there if they're just going to stand on stage. It feels a little counterproductive to bring them into a music rehearsal for that purpose. I also have several other jobs throughout. Anyway, all of my papers are gone, and so I'm a little lost, and that is A-okay. There are also things that I prep, like rehearsal reports and calls that get sent out during rehearsals. There are production performances, production calls, production meeting notes, vocal tracking, all of this paperwork that has to get done. So that's what I did throughout December, and that's what my ASMs worked on during rehearsals. There are also a lot of technical elements for the show, and as there were a lot of important parts of the show that needed to be tracked, I preemptively made a shift plot for any scene changes I knew we were going to have. This ended up helping us a lot during tech rehearsals as we were able to narrow it down. I had known from previous rehearsal processes that having an incomplete shift plot can really just start to make things a little more stressful. So as we were going through and little things like we had a wall fly in, anytime that wall flew in, I made sure that we were writing it down and it was highlighted and bolded so we knew that that was something that was really important that we would need a lot of hands on. So, this is my blocking sheets. We began blocking and choreographing on the 3rd day of rehearsal. So it was really important that I had blocking sheets made. During the staging of the show, I'm responsible for keeping track of any time an actor moves on stage, and this is sort of that drawn out. This is my blocking notes from opening night. The scene was, you can't tell because I had to change the exposure a lot. There's a lot of lines that were drawn on and erased. The scene got reblocked several times as we were getting more tech elements in, but ultimately this was roughly our like final draft of it all. As you can see, all of the characters, I'm so far away. It's so much easier if I'm just near them. So all of our characters are written out by their character name abbreviation that I write down on a different piece of paper. So Dee Dee over here is Dee Dee. Over here is Dee Dee, and I would draw out her path on each of the pages. And then I would go back in and I would write down all of this, which is just stage management slang for what they're doing in less words. And then all of these letters on the side correlate to little tiny letters that you kind of can't see. But then on the flip side where I have my script, all of those letters are pulled up on there for when that movement would happen. You can kind of see B went to each time, and so on the page where my script was, on each time I wrote a little B. What else? Throughout the rehearsal process, we also had weekly production meetings that we used to communicate all necessary things about the show. It's really important that we are having these meetings to sort of keep track of everything that's happening. But another thing was, in my rehearsal reports, anytime we would move a set piece down or across the stage or edit a little bit, I wanted to make sure that our lighting designer knew, so that he would not plan to have a light on a desk that was actually going to be 4 feet up. So it's really important to bring all this up during production meetings. My SM team. So the SM team is Reese Cedarhausen, myself, and Hannah Barbie. Reese and Hannah were both of my ASMs. I was incredibly grateful to have both of them. I wanted to foster a feeling of support between them. Because I like being very independent, and so I want my ASMs to be very independent. But I also knew that this was going to be Hannah's second time learning to ASM, and even though Reese had ASM before, I still wanted them to be able to feel empowered in their learning. I wanted them to feel confident in the task they were doing, and that once we got to tech, I wanted them to know that they were going to be running the backstage and that I wasn't going to be there. The SM team and the ASMs in particular are important for getting things set up before rehearsals and shows, as I was telling you. And the ASMs are also the head of our crew backstage during our shows. As I mentioned, neither of them were there for the first several weeks of rehearsal, but once they got there, it was really easy to start to move into things. I was luckily, in the time that they were gone, to have several former ASMs who knew the importance of this teamwork and coming together to work on things, as I had Sienna Glaze and Kristen Fry, so that would assist me during rehearsals where my ASMs were absent. Hannah Barbie, she did our phone tracking. We used actors' cell phones, and at a time we were going to use prop cell phones as well, and so she tracked anytime a phone was brought up in a scene. She also worked on the shift plot, and she took choreography videos. Reese Cedarhausen, he took attendance and was on book for most of the show, but both of them helped me with paperwork, with line notes, and assisting in scene changes during rehearsals where our crew was absent. Tech Week. This is a list of things that I did during Tech Week. Don't try and read it all, it's okay. Tech Week was actually one of the more laid-back techs that I've been a part of for a musical. As I mentioned, there were a lot of moving parts, and making sure that everything ran together was really crucial. And I thought the actual teching of everything was rather painless. Some of my roles during tech include putting up a sign-in sheet, making sure everyone is there and in places when they need to be, making sure the stage is swept and safe for the actors, facilitating moving through the show so that designers can build their cues in a timely manner, writing down the cues that I would call for the performance, ensuring that a lift call was had, and that the actors who engaged in intimacy had done their check-ins before we teched any of their scenes, organizing our set pieces backstage, ensuring my crew and actors knew how to move the set pieces, making sure the crew knew and were comfortable in running the rail every night, and keeping track of breaks. So yeah, it was like pretty chill. Easy. From the start of tech on Wednesday to the end of tech on Monday and the very last hour of Tuesday's rehearsal, we built all the cues for the show. We had Joe Beimer, who was doing our light design, Jason Sebastian doing our sound, David Ferguson on set, George Serafin on costumes, and the amazing Maddie Sequek mixing our cues and assisting with our music. Maddie was actually in rehearsals for about 2 weeks before we moved into tech, so that when we got into rehearsals, when we got into tech, she was able to plug in where certain songs started rather than us having to guess. After that, after our final run on our final hour on Tuesday, we did 3 full runs of the show before we got into opening night on Friday. So sorry. I'll just let you have a look at that for a second. Thank you. Most of our lighting and sound cues were connected to one another, so I didn't have to call any sound cues specifically. Instead, I would call lights that cued up sound. to our our light board operator, Aaron, who is also our assistant sound or lighting designer. I called light cues for the musical. I had called light cues for a musical before, but the prom was a lot more than I had ever called ever. If you saw The Sound of Music and you saw the prom, you knew they were very different. The Sound of Music was a lot more laid back than the prom was. But prom cues were very musically focused, and so I had to do a lot of counting in my head to make sure that all my cues came on beat. So these are my cues from the final dance break of It's Time to Dance, which occurs just before the finale. When I'm writing cues in my book, I'll lay it out. I have my little headset on, and I will just go through and make little marks of, oh, we said that when Get on the Floor goes, we need a light cue to change. Or I make my little boxes around, but until that day comes, it had to go on the word comes, and so I had to make sure that I was highlighting which specific section it went on. But as you can see, there was actually a lot of cues that didn't have words that it went on because there was a 48-second dance break or something like that. It's definitely more than that, but in my brain that's about as long as it was. And so instead, I wrote what everything went on. So 793 went on switching circles. 795 went on grand. I knew what that meant at one point, don't worry. But because so many of our cues were musically oriented, it was a lot of, most of these cues were either on beat 4 or beat 8. And so the whole time this was going, I would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, go, the whole time. So this was my favorite part of the show to call. If you're ever near here and someone starts singing it, I'm gonna start calling cues to it. It's my favorite, I can't help it. So my challenges and my successes. One of my successes was rail cues that I don't have listed, but calling the show in general and rail cues specifically. I'd worked with a rail before. The rail is our fly system. I'd worked with it before in little capacities. We had some things in 9 to 5. We had several things in 9 to 5 that flew out, and we had several things in Sound of Music, but we had a large wall for the prom that had to fly in and out. And we also had multiple signs that flew in and out during different scenes, and so it was a lot more rail cues than I'd ever called before. And they were also normally in the middle of very long cue sequences. So it was important that I got down the rhythm of the cues that I was calling in order to insert our rail cues in it, into different things. But during Tech Week, another success was advocating for others. We had a lot of people in the room. We had a director, a lighting designer, an assistant lighting designer, a sound designer, a mix engineer, a costume designer, an assistant costume designer, a props designer, set designer, music director, 2 assistant stage managers, 3 flywheel operators, 2 spot ops, a crew, and we had our whole cast. And I was at the center of it all. I'm in charge of managing communication during Tech and making sure that everything runs as smoothly as possible. And so that meant that I had to make sure that we were actually moving on and working through things. But I don't want to move on in something if people are unsure that they can do it again safely. And I wanted everyone to feel confident in what they were doing. So occasionally that meant that I was going to be advocating for others. I wanted to make sure that everyone backstage had an opportunity to run things that they felt needed to be ran again, whether that be running the rail again, running another costume change. I just wanted to make sure that they were all confident in what was happening, and I wanted to make sure that our designers had the time that they needed in order to tech all their cues. And if changes needed to be made, then I was going to do all that I could to facilitate these changes. Because there were so many parts in moving, and we wanted to move fast, I allowed time for everyone else to put in their work. But the second that this comes in my challenges, the second I would get stuck on something, I felt like I was just ruining the show somehow, and that because I needed to run a song one extra time, that magically the entire show was just never going to get finished. So I did my best to reassure myself that I was there to learn, and that sometimes this means it's going to take a minute for me to get cues off of the paper and into my brain. I am, however, proud of myself because this show ran very smoothly. There were very few bumps, and I left the show feeling like I left everything out on the stage, quite literally. I felt like there was nothing that I could do to have made a better run than I produced throughout the show, and that's a feeling that I've had a few times before, but in the prom specifically, I felt like I was just doing everything that I could, and it was a really great show because of that. Personally, I thought it was a great show. So my takeaway comes from Andrea Shell. The Andrea Shell. Be an expectation if you don't know it exists. And so that meant that I had to set expectations for myself, but I also had to let other people know that I needed those expectations, because I can't ask them to be an expectation of giving me an expectation if they don't know that expectation exists. So if that meant that I had to clarify with Darnell what he was wanting to get out of a rehearsal, the work that he wanted to get done, then I just needed to make sure that I was communicating these things to one another. But it also meant that I was setting expectations for myself. I sent out an email to the entire cast and crew right before Tech Week that was detailing, this is Tech Week. And in my brain, I was like, no, we're gonna get tech. It's gonna be Saturday. We're gonna run the show. That is so unrealistic of an expectation for me to set for myself. And so a lot of the times I was setting things and then kind of dialing back my own expectations for me. I'm simply a human, and I'm going to make mistakes, and that's going to have to be okay. I need to breathe and understand that everything is going to be okay eventually and move on until we're there. Dwelling on a lot of minor errors and on every part of my work that I thought could have been better or used more work is not helpful. This also helped me learn that there was a time for messing up and there was a time for dwelling on that, but there was also a time that you gotta pull yourself up by your bootstraps and roll on. I know I was unlikely to call major cue sequences right the first time, but I did put in my best work and I pushed forward through all my mistakes rather than letting them get to me in the middle of calling something. This allows me to enjoy a process more and relax into it and have the confidence in my abilities to get things done right, even if it takes a few tries to get there. So my thank yous. I'm going to do this quickly because thank yous are always my least favorite part of presentations. I want to thank my mom, dad, my sister, and my grandpa, and my pappy. I want to thank all my professors who have helped me out through my time at Xavier. There's been a couple. I want to thank Bridget Leak, my favorite theater history teacher, Brent Holmes and Andrea Shell for being my stage management professors, Sue Ann Pollard for being a stage management mentor. I also want to thank Joe and Steven for helping me out for the last 4 years and putting up with all the random questions I've asked and all the minor crises I've had in your offices. I want to thank my friends and my colleagues that have been here throughout my time at Xavier. I'm really grateful for all of you for supporting me. I want to thank my fellow SM Focus Abby for answering all of my calls and my texts of just, Abby, what do you mean I have a fly rail, please? I want to thank Kristen, Sienna, Josie, and Taylor for being my rocks throughout this time and for helping me feel confident in myself even when I wasn't feeling confident. All of the support has really come together and it's made for an amazing last 4 years.
We have time for a few questions for Renee.
Joe, sorry.
Do you have a dream show you would love to call?
Oh, no, I do. So I love theater, don't get me wrong. My favorite, the musical that I would like to call at least once is Hadestown. Big thing. But I want to do stage management for concerts as well. Like a Taylor Swift concert. Have you seen the visuals ever? Like, that's so much work to think about what that stage manager is doing. That is also something that I'm really, maybe one day. Grace?
Have you ever been in a situation in a show where you've had to invent a new piece of paperwork?
All the time. All the time I've invented new paperwork. I've made so many things. A lot of it isn't like making something up so much as it is finding someone else who's already done it. A lot of stage management, there's a lot of things that can be different throughout different processes, but a lot of it's the same thing. And so for Proctor, I made an entrance and exit tracker, which Abby had provided me like a copy of what they used at CSC, but it was really sort of making it into what we needed it to be. We don't track costumes like during rehearsals, other than like we knew they were going to have a bonnet and a little apron, so we would track those sorts of things. But other than that, we cut that column out entirely, and it became more of tracking individual things in backpacks. There was a lot of backpacks and a lot of things in it, and so it's more so taking a piece of paperwork that already exists and sort of developing it into what you need for a show. Yeah.
If you could tell little Renee stage managing their first show, what would you tell them?
I don't know, little Renee was very nervous about everything, so probably just like, take a deep breath. Drink some water and calm down. It's gonna be okay. You're gonna really love it, even if you get a little nervous sometimes. Anna?
So when you talked about teaching Allison, or helping Allison figure out how to stage manage to the best of her ability, you seem to really be passionate about that. Is teaching stage management something you'd ever be interested in?
Okay, so you gotta hear me out. I don't want to be a teacher for this whole part of teaching implies teaching kids or teaching younger people, because we have professors here who teach us, but I'm not good with working with kids, and I also don't like explaining myself more than once, and so sometimes when I have to teach things, it's just I'm frustrated that you haven't figured it out yet, when really that's so wild. No one has ever said that to me, so why do I think that about others? But but when I was with Allison was just so happy to be learning these things and was like, yeah, that's how it goes, and that's how it goes. And I was really grateful that I got to work with Allison, because she is so I want to be the best at whatever I'm doing, and whatever learning I have to do to get there is what I have to do. So maybe not teaching high school kids, but if I came back to Xavier one day and I was like, oh, hey guys, you want some help? I would love to help. I would love to help people who want to learn. Anyone else? Any final questions? Thank you.
Well, Renee, congratulations. Thank you for sharing.